Well, let's now turn our attention to the history of Khalistani terrorism and extremism in Canada, and why many people feel that Canada perhaps has been a little bit soft on this issue over the years. It's great to be joined now by Terry Milievski, who's a Canadian journalist, also the person who's the author of Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistani Project. Terry, great to have you joining us. I guess one of the reasons why so many people in India are bemused to see all of these pictures of Khalistani extremism and demonstrations and all of this ruckus that we see in countries like Canada is because Khalistan itself is a dead issue in India. It is a dead issue among the Sikhs in India. It's a dead issue in Indian Punjab. And perhaps no better way of demonstrating that than the fact that the last time you had elections in Punjab, the pro-Khalistani party only got 2.4% of the vote. So clearly there's not much resonance of any of this in India itself.
Yes, I think it was something like 2.48, so give them their due. They nearly made it all the way to 2.5% of the vote in Punjab. And this is something you're quite right to point it out, I think. There's such ignorance about this issue in the West. People not paying attention. It's not our problem. It's far away. It's been going on forever. It's bad news anyway. And much of the story, in Canada's case, does not reflect well on Canada anyway. So we'd rather not talk about it. And so people are simply not aware of the extent to which this issue has fallen off the map really 30 years ago in India, and that there is no support for it among the majority of the world's Sikhs. I mean, we've got roughly 75% of all the world's Sikhs live in Punjab. And you'd think their votes would count for something. I mean, mind you, that 2.5% they got in last year's election, I should point out, was a banner year. That was a good year for the Separatist Party of Simranjit Singh Mann, because in the previous election in 2017, they got 0.3% of the vote. Barely moved the needle above zero. Nota, none of the above got more votes than the Separatists did in that election. So this is something which is completely unknown among most Canadians, who think that, all the Sikhs are Khalistanis and that this is the will of the Sikhs. And the Sikhs say they're being genocided, as they call it, in India. They're being wiped out by, and I quote, a fascist and genocidal Hindu government, and therefore we should feel sympathetic to them. And India is to be vilified, and this sort of thing. It's a very there's a huge disconnect between reality and the way this issue is perceived in Canada and elsewhere in the West. The UK is another example where the propaganda of the Khalistanis has, in large measure, succeeded. That is to say, the rest of us have failed to get the message across.
All right, Terry, one of the other things that is mystifying many people, I don't want to get into the question of the assassination itself, whether it happened or didn't happen. There's no evidence that has been presented. But the entire question of justifying violence, justifying terrorism. Look, demonstrations do happen in democratic countries. But the fact that many of those people in Canada are actually calling for violence, they've been involved with terrorism, and yet there's been a very soft response. How does that tie in with the rule of law?
The government and the general public, I would say, are basically in lockstep on this question, that they are locked into an outdated model of the terrorism that is supposedly to be fought. What I mean is that they are locked into the idea that, well, terrorism is bombs going off. And there are no bombs going off. They're not blowing things up. So we're in the clear, right? There's nothing to worry about. Well, the problem, of course, as you rightly noted, is that there is instead a new model of terrorism, which is the propaganda, the disinformation, the misinformation, the burrowing into the political system, and the poisoning of the minds of children by a tide, really, an unseen tide by most people, I grant you, but there is a tide of disinformation online. Everybody can be a Khalistani holy warrior simply if they have an internet connection and a keyboard. And so they're all, maybe not under their own names, of course, because they don't want to run too many risks, but everyone can proselytize and broadcast curses and call down invective upon the heads of the Indian government, while simultaneously propagandizing about the genocide that is ongoing, according to Gopatwant Singh Pannoon, the voice of Sikhs for Justice, which is organizing the current referendum. They can say, for example, that the referendum is all about democracy, that it's about, and I quote Pannoon again, ballots, not bullets. Oh no, we're peaceful now. We're past the old days of blowing things up. And what did he? Who's the poster boy of the campaign again? Chosen by the same Pannoon, the poster boy of the campaign, and I'm talking 9-foot high posters the size of a building, glass with ceremonial sword and ornate turban of Talvinder Singh Parmar, the mastermind, of course, of the Kanishka bombing, the Air India bombing of 1985, which wiped out 331 completely innocent civilians. And so this is his chosen mascot or poster boy, after whom the referendum campaign that is supposed to be so peaceful is named. This man was a psychopath, but it's not just him. There's the voting center in Toronto that is named for a Toronto mass murderer who joined the Khalistan Tiger Force in Pakistan back in the day. There are the Australian voting centers named after the assassins of Indira Gandhi in 1984. I won't go on, but you get the point.
So, Terry, the aspect of this that is somewhat mystifying to many people watching this in Canada is, first of all of these referendums that are happening. You're having a referendum to say, oh, something in another part of the world should have independence or should have freedom. It's a bit strange because, as we were just discussing, there's no echo of that anywhere in India. It's a bit like me sitting in New Delhi and saying, oh, there should be a referendum or whether, I don't know, there should be independence in Addis Ababa or in South Africa or, Canada and some province. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is a lot of this is actual incitement of violence and terrorism. And surely that is something that should bother the Canadians also. It should bother the Canadian government, bother the Canadian people. And let's not forget that one of those acts of terrorism was actually one of the worst acts of terrorism ever affecting Canada. And I'm referring, of course, to the bombing of the Air India plane. So many Canadians lost their lives. This should be an emotive issue, not just in India, but also in Canada.
Well, they don't feel the pain. They don't see the impact. They don't see, as I say, nobody's blowing up Canada. And so if they're sending money to India to blow things up in India, well, not our problem. They're not attacking us. We're in our safe little cocoon, and we're not concerned with it. And at the same time, the sort of rolling series of videos and provocations that emanate from the Khalistanis in Canada is really quite remarkable when you come to think about it. I mean, Brampton, Ontario, so Little Punjab, if you like, in Canadian terms, where they had in June of this year, we're not talking old news, we're talking about, in this year, they had this enormous life-size tableau, a diorama, a life-size reenactment celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. With plenty of red paint splattered on the Prime Minister's sari of the figure of Mrs. Gandhi, so that kids would be sure to get the message. This was a bloody affair, number one. Number two, we are proud of it. So that's the kind of thing which goes on in Canada. And of course, we also have to take note of the what I call the killer posters, naming and shaming Indian diplomats.
Terry, I just want to come back again to that question of the rule of law, because look, I guess the point that is being made by Canada, by the US, by many in the West is you can't go around having targeted assassinations in a friendly country, especially a democratic country, especially a country where the judicial process actually works. That's the argument. And let's be honest, it's a fair argument. But the flip side of that is, what happens if that judicial process is not working? What happens if for 40 years you're going on saying this is something that is happening there? There are people who are inciting violence and terrorism. Those are people who are going to come and kill people in our country, kill people in India, potentially reignite flames and fires that were put out many, many years ago, 2 decades, 3 decades ago. So when that happens and when nobody is paying heed to those concerns and the judicial system is not working, then what happens? I guess that's one of the big questions that has to be asked now.
Yes, what do you do? And this is something that Canadians, I think, so far have not appreciated well enough. And that is that they get the idea that we don't want other countries pursuing their critics into our land and then be pursued and murdered by a foreign government. They get that. But the problem is that they don't see that this danger impacts Canadians where they live, and they see that they haven't appreciated enough, I think, the frustration on the Indian side at what amounts to basically 40 years, a generation and more of neglect by Canadians of Indian concerns. I mean that you go all the way back to 1982. And I was the one that dug out of the archives the records of that when Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, told Indira Gandhi, no, we're not going to extradite Talvinder Parmar, the Air India bomber. He was wanted for murder in India for killing a couple of policemen. They asked formally for extradition, and the Canadians said, no, we didn't want to get involved in India's internal squabbles. We didn't want to take sides. And besides, we thought that Parmar wouldn't get a fair trial in India. So we came up with an excuse. It was a very bizarre excuse because India didn't acknowledge the Queen as head of state, only as head of the Commonwealth. Therefore, the extradition treaty didn't apply. It was very almost comical excuse that they dreamed up to tell Mrs. Gandhi, no, that was 3 years before the Air India bombing. If he'd said yes, we'd all be a lot better off today. So that's an example, and it just continued all the way through. We ignored the warnings about the imminent attack on Air India. The RCMP were asleep at the switch. CSIS was asleep at the switch. And that's before the bombing, when they should have stopped it. They had the suspects under surveillance, for heaven's sake, for 3 months before the bombing and still didn't figure. They followed them to a test bombing in the woods. They still didn't figure out what was up to. They still didn't do anything about it. And then, after the bombing, they failed again. The Canadians, by failing to deliver to the victims' families some measure of justice. The court system, the legal system, seemed to be mainly occupied with discarding evidence that was deemed inadmissible. I'll spare you the details. It was a sorry display, and only one man, the bomb maker, went to jail. And the rest got off scot-free. Parmar, of course, himself was killed in Punjab by the Punjab police in 1992. So all of this unfolded in an atmosphere of almost complete indifference on the Canadian side. If the Indians got frustrated that Canada never acted, the Canadians didn't even know that. People like me dropped the ball in the media, failing to alert them. I did a documentary 20 years ago called Safe Haven, describing how I thought, anyway, that Canada had been a patsy and that it dropped the ball by not cracking down on terrorists operating in Canada. And it's the measure of my immense influence in Canada that absolutely nobody paid any attention to my documentary. And it only proceeded to get worse, not better. Indifference is the enemy here. And that explains in large measure the Indian frustration. And it almost explains, no, it doesn't go quite that far, but it almost explains why a hardline Indian prime minister might just decide, the hell with it. These Canadians are never going to do what is needed. I'm going to act.
All right, Terry, I guess if people had paid a lot more attention to this many, many years ago, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. But thank you so much for joining us with that perspective.
Thank you.